It was supposed to be a regular day, the kind that had grown all too familiar. The hum of the dialysis machine in the background as the nurse arrived promptly at 9 a.m., ready to tend to the needs of the protagonist's mother. A quiet routine, a necessary part of life. But today, as the protagonist settled into their home office, a call from the nurse broke the silence, cutting through the calm like a jagged shard of glass. The nurse's voice trembled with a mix of confusion and frustration. I'm being asked to leave. I can't. They're saying I'm not allowed to give your mom treatment today. The words hit like a punch to the gut. What do you mean, not allowed? The protagonist's mind raced. She's been treating my mother for months now. The nurse continued, barely holding back the panic. A woman from the HOA just showed up. She said I need permission from them to continue. I tried to explain, but she wouldn't listen. She's blocking me from even entering the house. The protagonist's fingers tightened around the phone. Their breath caught in their throat as they looked across the room, their eyes catching the framed photo of their mother from happier times, before the disease took hold, before everything changed. Now, something as simple as receiving medical care at home was being held hostage by an uninvited, unwelcome force. Who did this person think they were? The protagonist's first instinct was to call the HOA office to demand an explanation. But then another thought crossed their mind. What if this was more than just an overzealous neighbor with a vendetta? What if something darker was at play here? The thought made their stomach churn. They hung up with the nurse and grabbed their jacket, heading for the front door. Outside, the late morning sun gleamed in the sky, but it did little to ease the growing sense of urgency and unease. As they stepped onto the porch, they spotted her, Karen, the HOA enforcer. She stood in front of their mother's house with a clipboard in hand, arms crossed over her chest. Her sharp, judgmental eyes seemed to pierce through the air itself. She wasn't just blocking access to their home. No, she was asserting power. Karen turned to face the protagonist with a smug smile. I'm afraid I'll need to see some documentation before we allow any further medical visits, she said, her tone dripping with condescension. This is a new HOA rule, you see. The protagonist's heart skipped a beat. The audacity. The audacity to come to their doorstep, in the middle of a healthcare treatment, and make demands as if they had no rights to privacy or medical care. It felt like a slow, building fire inside. The sense that something was horribly off about this entire situation. The rules, the regulations, the power Karen seemed to think she had. They were all wrong. They were going to make this right. But first, the protagonist needed to know what the hell was going on. As Karen continued to rattle off more HOA jargon, the protagonist's mind began to work, calculating the angles. There's no way in hell that a neighborhood association has the power to interrupt medical care. There must be a mistake here, a serious one. But just how far would Karen go to enforce her version of the rules? And how would the protagonist handle this unexpected battle? The tension in the air thickened, and with every word Karen spoke, the protagonist could feel the storm brewing inside, ready to unleash. This was just the beginning. The door slammed shut behind the protagonist, the sound of it echoing in the quiet street. The sun still hung high in the sky, but the warmth it offered felt distant, irrelevant to the cold weight of the confrontation they were about to face. Their footsteps quickened as they marched towards Karen, who was still standing at the foot of the porch, practically radiating authority. Karen had already turned back to the front door, as if the protagonist's arrival wasn't worth so much as a glance. She hadn't even fully noticed them approaching until they spoke, their voice hard with controlled anger. What's going on here? Why are you stopping my mother's treatment? Karen turned slowly, almost theatrically, her eyes scanning the protagonist up and down before settling on their face. Well, she said, her voice a mix of superiority and satisfaction. I'm afraid the HOA has new regulations, and I'm simply enforcing them. The protagonist's jaw clenched. What regulations? This is life-saving treatment for my mother. You don't get to play gatekeeper to her health. Karen raised an eyebrow, her smile widening ever so slightly. "Oh, I'm afraid I do," she said, tapping her clipboard for emphasis. "There's a clause in the bylaws that prohibits anyone from receiving in-home medical services without prior approval from the HOA. I'm simply following the rules." The protagonist's blood ran cold. It didn't make sense. Medical care wasn't something that could be regulated by a homeowners association. That was illegal. The protagonist had worked in healthcare inspection long enough to know that. They had seen the kinds of abuses that could happen when people like Karen were given too much power. But what was her game here? And why now? "Let me get this straight," the protagonist said, their voice low but sharp. "You're telling me that a nurse who's been coming here for months, who's been following proper procedure, can no longer provide care to my mother because of some new rule that nobody here even knows about?" Karen's smile didn't fade. "That's exactly what I'm saying. The rules are the rules. I'm just doing my job." The protagonist's eyes narrowed. The more Karen spoke, the more the hairs on the back of their necks stood up. Something wasn't adding up. Who exactly had approved this new rule? And why wasn't anyone in the neighborhood informed? It was clear that Karen wasn't going to back down. But the protagonist wasn't about to let this continue. "You don't have the right to stop my mother's care. If you want to fight this, we'll take it to court." The words felt sharp and final, like a challenge thrown down in the middle of the street. Karen's smug smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, leaning forward slightly as though savoring the opportunity to put the protagonist in their place. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. The HOA is very strict. You could try taking it to court, but that won't change the fact that you'll be in violation of the rules. And that could have consequences. Big ones." A chill ran down the protagonist's spine, and their grip tightened around the doorframe. They could feel the tension building, thick and suffocating in the air. Karen wasn't just following rules. She was threatening them. And the worst part, she seemed to enjoy it. The protagonist took a deep breath, forcing their voice to remain steady. "I'm going to get to the bottom of this," they said, their words hanging heavy in the air. "And when I do, I'll make sure you regret blocking my mother's care." For the first time, Karen's smile slipped. She wasn't used to people challenging her. Her eyes darkened, but she didn't respond right away. Instead, she simply turned and began to walk away, tossing over her shoulder, "I'm just doing my job." But the protagonist wasn't done. Not yet. They stood there for a long moment, watching Karen walk down the driveway, her heels clicking on the pavement. With every step she took, a new thought began to form in the protagonist's mind. Karen's not working alone. There was more to this than just a rogue HOA agent enforcing silly rules. Someone else, someone higher up, was pulling the strings. And they were going to find out who. The protagonist didn't know it yet, but they had just stepped into a game far bigger than they realized. A game where the stakes weren't just their mother's health, but something much more dangerous. The front door clicked shut with a finality that echoed through the house. The protagonist stood in the hallway, a quiet storm of emotions swirling within them. Confusion, anger, disbelief. Who did Karen think she was? They ran a hand through their hair, staring at the phone in their hand, the number for the HOA office still glaring on the screen. The voice of the nurse echoed in their mind. "I can't come back until they approve me." The protagonist had to act fast. But how? They needed answers, real answers. What had happened to this new rule? Who had the authority to impose such a thing? And why had Karen been so confident in enforcing it, without the slightest hint of doubt? With a determined breath, the protagonist dialed the HOA office. As the phone rang, their mind raced through the legalities, through their training as a federal health inspector. They knew their rights. They knew what was supposed to be legal and what wasn't. But something felt off about this situation, like the rules were being twisted just enough to make it seem legit. "Hello, this is the HOA office. How may I assist you?" The voice on the other end was polite, almost too polite, and the protagonist instantly bristled. They could hear the edge of uncertainty in the receptionist's voice. Something wasn't right. "I'd like to speak with someone in charge," the protagonist replied, their voice measured, controlled, yet cold with authority. "I have a problem with one of your new regulations, specifically one that prohibits medical visits in the neighborhood." There was a pause, followed by a hurried rustling on the other end. "I'm afraid I can't provide that information," the receptionist said quickly. "You'll need to talk to—" "Who do I need to speak with?" the protagonist interrupted, their patience wearing thin. They had no time for small talk or vague answers. "I was just blocked from receiving medical care for my mother by one of your agents, and I want to know who approved this rule." Another pause. Then the receptionist spoke again, but this time there was something different in her voice. "I'll put you through to Mrs. Greer. She's the board chair. She'll be able to help you with that." The call clicked, then switched. The protagonist found themselves now facing the head of the HOA. Mrs. Greer's voice was sharp, professional, and seemingly calm, but there was a subtle tension that the protagonist could almost feel through the phone. "How can I help you?" Mrs. Greer asked. "I'm calling about the new rule banning medical visits in the neighborhood," the protagonist began, keeping their voice as neutral as possible, though the rising heat of frustration couldn't be fully contained. "My mother requires regular dialysis treatments, and yet I've just been told by your staff that medical personnel are no longer allowed to make home visits unless they have HOA approval. Who approved that, and where is the documentation?" There was a long pause. Too long. Mrs. Greer's voice came back, this time clipped, almost defensive. "I'm not sure what you're referring to. The HOA enforces general guidelines for the community, but medical matters, that's not something we typically oversee." The protagonist's blood ran cold. "Really? Because Karen, the woman who just blocked my mother's nurse, seemed to think otherwise. And you're telling me that the HOA doesn't have anything to do with medical services?" "No," Mrs. Greer replied quickly, almost too quickly. "The HOA doesn't regulate medical care." The protagonist's instincts flared. Something was wrong. Something big. This was a game of smoke and mirrors. Karen didn't act alone. The protagonist's voice dropped low, their next words clear and cutting. "So Karen was acting on her own when she told my nurse to leave. You're telling me no one in the HOA authorized this interference?" Another pause. Then Mrs. Greer's voice dropped in tone, much quieter now. "I'm not at liberty to discuss this further at the moment. I suggest you come by the next board meeting to raise your concerns. Until then, I cannot provide any other details." The call ended with a click that seemed more final than any of the previous exchanges. The protagonist stood there, holding the phone in disbelief. What the hell just happened? Karen hadn't been acting alone. The answers weren't just hidden. They were being guarded. Someone in the HOA, or maybe even beyond it, had orchestrated this entire thing. There was a deeper, darker reason why they were pushing so hard to control medical visits. And the protagonist had just scratched the surface. What they had uncovered wasn't just about neighborhood rules. It was about something far more insidious, something that might involve more than just one rogue agent. They had to know more. They had to dig deeper. And they would, because now, more than ever, they couldn't afford to back down. Their mother's health, and the safety of everyone in their neighborhood, depended on it. The protagonist paced the living room, each step heavier than the last. Their mind churned with frustration, the conversation with Mrs. Greer replaying over and over. Something about it didn't sit right. No one had the authority to block medical care like this, and yet there was a veil of secrecy around the whole situation, one that was starting to feel far too deliberate. Who's behind this? The thoughts twisted in their mind like a tangled knot. The board chairwoman's evasive answers, Karen's smug certainty, the subtle but unmistakable fear in the receptionist's voice. It all pointed to something bigger. But what? And why now? The protagonist knew they couldn't just sit idly by. They had to act. But the idea of going toe-to-toe with the entire HOA board seemed daunting. They needed leverage. They needed a card, something powerful enough to make the HOA back off without risking more damage to their mother's care. A sudden realization hit them. They had one thing the HOA didn't: an insider's knowledge of the law. As a federal health inspector, the protagonist had access to regulations, loopholes, and enforcement mechanisms that few could fathom. They weren't just any resident. They were someone who could take down an entire organization with a single well-placed complaint. The protagonist's eyes narrowed as the pieces began to fall into place. If the HOA was behind this, then they were breaking laws. They were interfering with federally mandated healthcare, something that couldn't be ignored. If they won't come clean voluntarily, I'll make them. The protagonist quickly dialed their own number at the federal agency, a direct line to a trusted colleague. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice picked up. "Hey, it's me. I need you to do something for me. Fast." "What's going on?" the colleague asked, a touch of concern in their tone. "I need you to pull all the documentation on healthcare violations in this neighborhood, specifically the HOA's involvement in restricting medical visits. If they've been trying to block home healthcare, it's a direct violation of federal law. I need to know who's behind this, and I need the facts." There was a pause. "Okay, I'll get on it. But you know this could get messy, right? If the HOA is involved, there might be more going on here than we can see." "I know," the protagonist said, voice tight with determination. "I just need to know how far it goes. I'll handle the rest." They hung up quickly, already plotting their next move. Time was running out, and they couldn't afford to wait. The nurse had already been blocked once, and who knew what would happen if they tried again? But with this new information, they might have a way in. The board meeting was coming up in a few days. It wasn't much time, but the protagonist knew that was when they'd strike. They'd walk in armed with facts, with hard evidence that not only would invalidate the HOA's authority, but could potentially shut down their illegal actions for good. As they paced back and forth, their phone buzzed, jolting them out of their thoughts. It was a text from their colleague. "I've got the documents. You're going to want to see this." The protagonist's heart raced. This was it. The information they needed to take down the HOA was now in their hands. They opened the message, scanning the files quickly. As they read, a sickening realization settled in their stomach. The HOA wasn't just a rogue organization with misplaced authority. It was part of something much more sinister, a larger network of housing communities that had been systematically violating healthcare rights for years. And the worst part, this wasn't just a few rogue members. The entire board was complicit. The protagonist's fingers tightened around the phone. This wasn't just about their mother's treatment anymore. It was about exposing a conspiracy that ran deep, one that could change everything. They were about to blow the lid off an operation that had gone unchecked for too long. Now, the question wasn't whether they could win. It was whether they were ready for the storm that was about to hit. The evening felt eerily still, the silence in the house thick with the tension building inside the protagonist. The documents from their colleague were still open on their laptop, the weight of the information heavy in the air. The lines blurred between the personal and the professional. What started as an ordinary battle to protect their mother's medical care was now something much more dangerous, a fight to expose an underground network that had quietly, methodically, undermined basic rights for years. They could feel it now, how the walls were closing in, the storm gathering just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. And they weren't alone. They knew that if they played this right, they could bring the whole operation to its knees. But it would take every ounce of control, every legal weapon they had in their arsenal, to make that happen. The board meeting was tomorrow. They would confront them there, armed with proof of federal violations, with undeniable documents in hand. But there was a problem. The HOA had been incredibly careful, covering their tracks. The names of the individuals involved were masked behind layers of bureaucracy, hidden behind legal jargon that made it seem like nothing was amiss. The protagonist's phone buzzed again, dragging them out of their thoughts. It was an unknown number, but they didn't hesitate. "Hello," Is this the federal health inspector? The voice on the other end was cold, clipped. A male voice. I'm calling in regards to your inquiry about medical visits in your neighborhood. The protagonist froze. They recognized the tone, the formality. This wasn't a random call. It was someone from the HOA. Someone who knew they were onto something. I'm listening, they said, their voice calm, but their pulse quickening. You should be careful, the voice said, the words slow, deliberate. You've been poking around in things you don't understand. You think you're playing a game, but you're not. This isn't just about your mother's treatments. It's much bigger than that. So unless you want to make things difficult for yourself, I suggest you back off. Consider this a warning. The air in the room seemed to freeze, the weight of the threat settling over the protagonist like a heavy cloak. But there was no fear, only a cold, quiet resolve. Whoever this was, they'd just made a fatal mistake. The protagonist wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when they were so close. Let's get one thing straight, the protagonist replied, their voice low, each word laced with purpose. I don't back down. Not from bullies, not from corruption. Not when lives are at stake. I'm going to expose everything. And there's nothing you can do to stop me. For a moment, there was silence on the other end. Then the voice spoke again, softer this time, as if trying to mask the hint of panic. You think you can win this fight. You're up against something much more powerful than you realize. You won't even see the consequences coming. The line went dead with a final click. The protagonist sat there for a long moment, their hands trembling ever so slightly. The message was clear now. Whoever they were dealing with, they weren't just ordinary HOA officials. They were part of something far more dangerous, something with far-reaching power. The threat wasn't just about their mother's care. It was personal. They were trying to intimidate them into silence. But that only fueled the fire. They knew what they had to do. This was no longer about getting their mom her dialysis treatment. This was about justice, about showing the world what people in power were willing to do to silence the truth. The protagonist stood, a sudden rush of adrenaline making their heart race. They glanced at the clock. It was late, but they couldn't sleep now. Not when everything was about to change. Tomorrow's meeting wouldn't be just a simple confrontation. It would be the beginning of something far larger. A fight not just for one family, but for everyone who had been harmed by this hidden network of corruption. They could feel the storm building, its winds howling, ready to tear down everything in its path. And the protagonist was right in the center of it, determined to ride the wave straight to the heart of the truth. Tomorrow, the cards would be laid on the table, and it was all or nothing. The next day, the protagonist arrived at the HOA board meeting with a calm exterior, but their heart was a storm of anxiety and anticipation. The board members were seated around the long, polished table, their faces a mask of politeness and indifference. Mrs. Greer, the board chairwoman, sat at the head, her sharp eyes scanning the room, her posture perfect, a picture of power. But the protagonist wasn't fooled. Behind the cold professionalism, they could see the tension in the way Mrs. Greer's fingers tapped the tabletop, the slight rigidity in her shoulders. The calm was just a facade. The protagonist didn't wait for the formalities to begin. Stepping to the front, they placed a thick folder down in the center of the table, the sound of the file hitting the wood echoing in the silence. All eyes turned to them. I assume you're all aware of why I'm here, the protagonist said, their voice cutting through the room like a blade. I've been blocked from receiving medical care for my mother, and I'm not leaving until I get answers. Mrs. Greer's expression tightened, but she didn't speak. The rest of the board sat motionless, their faces unreadable. The protagonist could almost feel their collective unease pressing down like a weight. This was no longer just about them. It was about power, and how much they were willing to risk to maintain it. You've been interfering with federally mandated health care, the protagonist continued, their voice unwavering. And you've been doing it for longer than you realize. You've been blocking medical visits, restricting care, and hiding behind your rules to cover up your actions. But I have evidence, Evidence that proves what you're doing is not only illegal, it's dangerous. The room shifted. The board members exchanged quick glances, but none of them spoke. Mrs. Greer's eyes narrowed, but she still held her composure. You seem quite certain of your facts, but I'm afraid you're mistaken. The HOA has always followed the law. Any claims of misconduct are baseless. The protagonist's lips curled into a thin smile, knowing that the time for diplomacy had passed. Let's see how baseless they are. They flipped open the folder, revealing copies of the documents they'd received from their federal colleague. Records detailing violations of healthcare rights, evidence of an illegal network of housing associations systematically restricting medical access, and communications that linked the HOA to multiple instances of withholding life-saving treatments. The gasps around the table were barely audible, but they were there. The board members were no longer indifferent. They were alarmed. You're not the first to try this, Mrs. Greer said, her voice steady, but there was a crack in it now, the first sign of vulnerability. People have come before you, tried to expose us, and failed. You won't be any different. The protagonist leaned in, their gaze unwavering. Maybe they didn't have this. They pulled out a final document, an internal email chain that identified key figures within the HOA, individuals who were directly responsible for crafting and implementing the new regulations. The names were all there. The stakes were suddenly much higher. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then one of the board members, a man with graying hair and glasses, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. You don't know what you're dealing with, he said, his voice low and urgent. You think you can bring us down. You have no idea what we're capable of. The protagonist's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about healthcare anymore. They were up against something bigger than a rogue HOA. It was a machine. But that didn't matter now. The protagonist had already crossed the point of no return. I don't need to know what you're capable of, they said, their voice like ice. I just need to know what you're hiding. And I will make it public, no matter what it takes. A sudden, almost imperceptible shift in the room made the air crackle with tension. Mrs. Greer's eyes flickered to the man who had spoken, then back to the protagonist. You don't understand the consequences of what you're doing, she said, her voice a venomous whisper now. You think this is about you, but it's not. This is about protecting the greater good. The greater good? The protagonist's voice was sharp, incredulous. You're using that excuse to justify denying people the care they need. You're playing God with people's lives, and I won't stand for it. At that moment, the door behind them creaked open, and the protagonist caught a glimpse of movement in the hallway. An ominous shadow. It was a momentary distraction, but it was enough to make the protagonist pause, their senses on high alert. Something was about to happen, something that would tip the scales. And the question was, what would it be? The silence in the room felt suffocating now, charged with the knowledge that this was the tipping point. The door clicked shut, the sound slicing through the tension in the room. The protagonist's eyes darted to the hallway, where the shadow had disappeared just as quickly as it had appeared. But there was no time to focus on it now. The storm was already here, and they were at the center of it. Mrs. Greer leaned forward, her once calm demeanor now cracking. You don't understand what you're dealing with, she said, her voice laced with an edge. This isn't just about you or your mother. This is about something much bigger. You think you can tear down everything we've built with a few documents and threats. The protagonist's heart hammered in their chest. The board members sat, frozen, as though awaiting some signal. The air crackled with the feeling of a game that had turned dangerously real. I understand perfectly, the protagonist said, their voice unwavering. You're protecting a system of corruption. A system that exploits people's health for profit and power. And that ends today. For a moment, no one spoke, but the words hung in the air, thick with the weight of truth. The protagonist had just unleashed a powerful accusation, and they could see the flicker of fear in Mrs. Greer's eyes. But fear quickly gave way to something colder, something darker. Suddenly, the man with graying hair stood up, his face now contorted in anger. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "There are people in this city who don't like it when their plans are disrupted. You think you can expose us and walk away unharmed." The protagonist's pulse quickened, but they stood their ground. What was he threatening? It was clear now that the HOA was just a small cog in a much larger machine, a machine they were clearly afraid of losing control over. Before the protagonist could respond, the door opened again. This time, it wasn't just any board member who entered. A tall, well-dressed man in a dark suit walked in with an air of authority, his eyes scanning the room with sharp precision. He exuded a calm, almost predatory energy. The board members visibly shifted in their seats, and Mrs. Greer's face drained of color. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's gaze moved from Mrs. Greer to the protagonist, his lips curving into a slight smile. "It seems we have a situation," he said, his tone smooth, calculated. "And I believe it's one that requires resolution." The room froze. The name was enough to make the hairs on the back of the protagonist's neck stand up. Mr. Blackwell. The name wasn't unfamiliar. It was whispered among certain circles, tied to power and influence that reached far beyond any HOA. He was a fixer, a man who took care of problems. "Mr. Blackwell," the protagonist said, forcing themselves to stay calm despite the tightening grip of fear. "I'm not here for your games. I'm here for the truth. You're blocking healthcare. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows about it." Mr. Blackwell chuckled softly, the sound smooth and chilling. "Oh, I think you'll find that truth is subjective," he said, his smile never wavering. "You've stepped into a world far beyond your understanding. And unfortunately for you, you've made the mistake of thinking that you can fight it." The room was thick with unspoken threats, but the protagonist refused to back down. They knew exactly who they were dealing with now, and the stakes had just been raised higher than they ever could have anticipated. The door clicked shut behind Mr. Blackwell, the soft sound a harbinger of something much darker. Mrs. Greer and the others shifted uncomfortably, their faces tight with anxiety. It was clear this was no longer a simple HOA dispute. This was a battle for their lives. "Let me make myself clear," Mr. Blackwell said, his voice cold and steady. "You think you can expose us. You think you can just walk in here with your documents and your accusations and destroy everything we've built. I'm afraid you've underestimated the forces you're up against. You're playing a dangerous game." The protagonist's breath caught in their throat, but they forced themselves to stay focused, refusing to give an inch. "I don't care who you are or what you represent," they said, their voice low and steady. "What you're doing is wrong, and I will stop it." Mr. Blackwell's smile faded, his eyes hardening. "Then I suppose we'll see who's right in the end." The door clicked open again, and the meeting room seemed to close in on the protagonist, the walls closing tighter and tighter. Something was coming, and the question wasn't if the storm would break. It was when. The protagonist's mind raced, trying to calculate their next move. But it was clear now. This battle was far from over, and they had just taken a step into a war that could cost them everything. The clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed Mr. Blackwell's ominous words. The walls of the meeting room seemed to pulse with the weight of the unspoken threat. The protagonist could feel the pressure building inside them, every muscle tensed, every thought racing. This was the moment, the culmination of all their efforts. But now, faced with Blackwell and the dark undercurrent of power swirling in the room, the stakes were higher than ever. For a long moment, no one spoke. The board members were motionless, as if waiting for some signal, some shift in the air to tell them what to do. Mrs. Greer's earlier confidence had all but evaporated, her expression now tight with fear. The quiet, seemingly polite facade was crumbling. The protagonist knew this was the tipping point. This was where the facade of power would either collapse or get even more dangerous. The protagonist exhaled slowly, meeting Blackwell's cold stare. "I'm not here to play games. You've crossed a line. What you're doing is illegal, and you can't hide behind your suits and your threats forever." The air seemed to crackle with Blackwell's barely contained rage, but he still maintained his icy composure. "You think that exposing a few corrupt individuals is going to change anything? You're a small pawn in a much larger game. Do you even understand the forces you've stirred up?" The protagonist's heart pounded, but they stood firm. They had never felt more certain of their path. "I've stirred up a lot more than that. I've got a team of federal agents on standby. Everything's in place. You're going to face consequences for every life you've put in danger, for every person you've denied care." The finality in their words hung in the air like a dare. Blackwell's eyes flashed with something dangerous. But then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. He leaned back, his lips curling into a slow, deliberate smile. "Do you really think you've won?" he asked, his voice low, almost taunting. "You've got your documents, your accusations, but what do you have to back them up? There's always a way out of this. Always." The words hit like a slap, but the protagonist refused to show any weakness. They reached into their bag and pulled out a thick folder, this one heavier than the others. Their eyes met Blackwell's with an unspoken promise. "I didn't come here just to expose you," they said, voice steady. "I came here to end it." They slammed the folder onto the table, the force of it loud enough to make everyone jump. Blackwell's eyes flickered to the file. For the first time, a hint of uncertainty crossed his face. The protagonist didn't give him time to recover. "Inside this folder is the proof you think you can deny," they continued. "Every player in your network is named, every transaction, every document. And not just the HOA. I've got links to every corrupt individual tied to your little scheme, every person you've paid off, every shadowy figure pulling your strings. This isn't just about healthcare. It's about racketeering, fraud, violating human rights. And this time, it's all on the record." For a moment, Blackwell was silent, his eyes locked on the file, his jaw clenching. The other board members had turned pale, clearly seeing the gravity of the situation. Mrs. Greer, the calm and composed leader, now looked as if she were about to crack. "You think you can bring us down just like this?" Blackwell finally said, his voice a growl. "You think they'll listen to you? You think anyone's going to care?" The protagonist smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was one of cold, quiet certainty. "They will, because I've already made sure they will. I've sent this to every federal agency that matters. You'll be facing investigations at local, state, and federal levels. The consequences of your actions aren't just legal anymore. You're going to be under a microscope you can't escape from." The board members shifted uncomfortably, but none of them spoke. Blackwell's face darkened, his expression now one of barely contained fury. But it was too late. A phone buzzed on the table, and Blackwell's eyes darted to it. Just a brief moment of distraction, but enough for the protagonist to see the flicker of panic in his eyes. Then, as quickly as it had arrived, the confidence drained from Blackwell's face. His hand gripped the armrest of his chair as if to steady himself, but it was clear, his control was slipping. They had him cornered. "You will pay for this," he snarled, but there was no conviction in his voice anymore. It was the final gasp of a predator who had just realized it had been caught. The protagonist nodded, the weight of the moment settling over them. Not today. Not anymore. They turned to leave the room, the sound of their footsteps echoing behind them. Mrs. Greer, Blackwell, the entire board, they could only watch as the protagonist walked out of the room, knowing that the storm had just begun. But this time, the protagonist wasn't running. They were standing tall, ready to face whatever came next.